Hello world, I'm Ethan Zindler with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, doing my first ever Google Hangout here with the folks from C2ES. And so it's my pleasure to be here today, and I've got two great guests. We're going to do actually a bunch of guests coming up, but I think in many ways you guys are great to start with. I, as an American over from Washington, I think both of you based in Washington as well, and we're going to hear a little bit about some of the politics going on around the climate negotiations. First, I would ask you both to introduce yourselves. Bob, go ahead if you would.
Thanks for that introduction. My name is Bob Perciasepe. I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. It's a non-partisan, independent think tank in Washington, D.C. that works with businesses, states, local governments, and the federal government on sound, common sense climate policy.
Elliot?
And I'm Elliot Diringer, Executive Vice President of C2ES, and have been very focused on preparing for these climate negotiations underway now in Paris and contributing to success here in Paris.
Great, so the two of you, I mean, there's a bunch of folks here who are municipal leaders at this event today, but the two of you actually, I think, have had a little closer role to the actual negotiations that have been going on. First of all, how do you think they're going so far? We're about a week in now.
Well, I think it's probably the early part of the jostling, and I think Elliot has been keeping a little closer tab on it. I think, Elliot, you may want to chime in on how
I mean, it's always tough going in the first week. We haven't seen a lot of concrete progress, but frankly, coming into Paris, we've seen more political will than ever from governments. We saw a huge number of heads of state on the first day injecting some momentum. So I think in the end that will translate into a very positive outcome.
This was an unusual set of talks in some sense, in that really by design, everybody came in with their own pledges, their own INDCs. And then the idea was essentially everyone, write your own part of the symphony, and then we'll come in and we'll play it all together here in Paris for a week. But there's some key aspects, right, that still need to be hammered out in terms of how you actually make sure people follow through on promises they make. If you could tell us a little bit about what the sort of outstanding thorny issues are in the negotiations at this point.
Sure. I mean, well, first, this idea that everybody comes in with their own nationally determined contribution, that provides some flexibility for countries to design their own plans, and that's what's enabled such broad participation that we're seeing already. But you're absolutely right. We need the means through the agreement to hold countries accountable for those promises, through transparency, by requiring them to report to the world what steps they're actually taking to follow through. So figuring out the exact terms for a process like that is difficult. Figuring out the financial arrangements, how the support will be provided to the poorer countries that really need it, that's a major issue. How you describe the balance of effort across developed and developing countries, that's something that's shifting. Need to come to terms on that. So those are some of the tough issues that still need to be ironed out and need to be put into a set of words that everybody can agree on.
Sure.
Combining the answer to the first question with this one, you not only did you have 150 heads of state here, but you have 170 countries who said, we recognize we have to do something. And they put together their own plan and put it forward. That has never happened before. So that, in addition to the issues that has to bind that together, which I think you described it in an interesting analogy, that level of participation, even in advance of coming together, bodes well. It doesn't guarantee everything will come out, but it is certainly setting up a situation that has been different than previous COPs.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, our research at Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others have suggested two things. One, in some cases, the countries are proposing to do, their INDCs are actually less ambitious than what we think will happen anyway because of the development of clean energy. And two, when you add up all the INDCs, they don't actually really get particularly close to preserving a so-called 2-degree scenario. I guess on the second part of the question, is the 2-degree goal essentially off the table now?
I don't think we can say that. If you add up all the contributions, they bring us much closer to putting us on a pathway to 2 degrees. You're absolutely right. They don't get us all the way, which is why a really essential component of this agreement needs to be an understanding that countries come back to the table periodically, every 5 years, to re-up their contributions, to come in with more ambitious contributions. Hopefully, over time, that'll put us on the 2-degree pathway, but really the aim has to be bringing us closer and closer to that as we go forward.
This is if all of these proposals have been, or these individually determined contributions or intended contributions are aggregated up, they do make a significant dent in business as usual. But you're right, it doesn't get us all the way to the 2-degree goal, and I think it's important to maintain a goal. And that has to be part of the agreement, and that drives the increased ambition with the periodic renewal.
I have to ask about domestic politics. All three of us are over here from Washington and Paris, and while we've been here in the last week or so, the U.S. Congress has taken action to try to undermine the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan. Bob, you really were one of the principal architects of the Clean Power Plan in your former life with the Environmental Protection Agency. I guess, first of all, are you surprised by this? And second of all, does it undercut the U.S. position here in Paris to have Congress back home taking these steps?
Well, I mean, to answer that last part right up front, I mean, my experience over the last 24 hours being here, and Elliot certainly having been involved with the international conversation going on for many, many months, is I'm going to say most, if not all, of the key negotiators and heads of state understand United States politics. We think that they are perhaps naive about it, but they're not. They understand the essentially symbolic nature of a congressional vote in the face of a sure presidential veto that won't be able to be overridden. That is what's going to happen. And so you look at it in that context where everybody knows that that's what's going to happen. People are not paying that much attention to it. They know it's happening. They recognize that there's a diversity of views in the United States. But there's always a diversity of views.
These deals that we're talking about, this agreement we're talking about, is supposed to last decades.
Yes,
right?
That's correct.
And last I checked, we're going to have a new president by January of 2017. So isn't this whatever check Obama writes here is only as good as the next president, right?
Yeah. Well, in the middle of these negotiations, or in the middle of the lead up to the negotiations, many of the countries change governments also.
Right.
Australia, Canada. Those
are not the second largest CO2 emitter.
No, they're
in the
not.
world.
They're not the second largest. And the United States, by every stretch of the imagination, is a key leader in these discussions. And anything is possible. I mean, anything can happen. And there are 2 points you have to say: is something possible, and then if it is, well, how probable is it that it'll occur? So it is possible that there'll be a new president.
Right.
I mean, that's going to happen.
Right.
It is possible that president may be opposed to some of these policies. Right. But if you look at history, how probable is it that a president actually goes through the rulemaking process to take a rule that is publicly popular away? I don't think you'll find an example where that has ever happened. Right. Now, you can withdraw something on its way to being enacted, but once it's enacted, to actually go through the public process, you can't do it by fiat. You have to go through a public process to remove it from the books. And that will require an act of Congress, or it'll require a regulatory process that's subjected to public affairs. So, something that has got broad public support in the United States, and I think that's a key message to the rest of the world. It's not just what you hear in Washington, D.C., even though the three of us hang out there every once in a while. It is really what does the American public believe in, and so it'll make it politically difficult, or at least with some risk, for somebody to try to really overturn
I would
that.
at least argue that it at least suggests that the highest stakes for U.S. environmental policy next year is the presidential campaign, probably above all else, right?
Yes.
Would you agree on that?
Yes, the president has some very significant powers in environmental policy making, which have been given to him.
Does it worry you that not one single Republican, maybe with the exception of John Kasich, has acknowledged, and George Pataki, who doesn't even make it into the big kid debates, has even acknowledged that climate change is a problem?
There's a big difference between campaigning and governing. I think we need to discount the kind of rhetoric you hear at this stage in the campaign. Once the president comes into office, I think the equation changes. Any incoming president is going to have to weigh very carefully the political risks of trying to roll back a policy that has broad public support, like Bob said, and it's going to have to weigh the diplomatic risks of pulling out of a global agreement that every other country has signed on to. So I think there's some significant staying power both to the policies that have been put in place in the United States and to the agreement once it's there.
So, but again, just go back to my, maybe it's a good summary on that conversation, is that, there are many things that are possible, but how probable are they really under almost any scenario? As long as the public support for action on climate change continues to grow in the United States, those risks that Elliot just outlined are going to be there.
Right.
It doesn't mean that a new president couldn't make these different changes, but it won't be like it's an automatic.
The point is that, right now you have cities, you have states, you have companies developing the strategies, making the investments to follow through on the trends required by these policies. Once that's set in motion, it's going to be very hard to reverse, and people are going to see that it's easier than they may have thought, and in fact that there are dividends being paid. So I think that will help to support and sustain the efforts going forward.
In many ways, that's one of the underlying elegance of the approach that we're taking on mitigation of greenhouse gases from electric power, and that each state will have to develop its plan. We already have 10 states in the United States that have a price on carbon, and we expect that there'll be more added in this process because they'll want to avail themselves of cooperating with their neighbor states. So when you have companies making the kinds of pledges we're seeing, you have cities gathered here today in the beautiful city hall in Paris, and you have states moving further and further along. That also embeds out there in the system an important thing. This is a really important point.
Well, I've got someone talking in my ear saying we're done. So it's but just a shame because I feel like we're just getting started. But thanks, guys. This has really been very interesting. I appreciate you shedding some light on the negotiations and giving us a little broader context and everything. And I guess I'm supposed to look at that camera as I say all of that. But thank you very much to my two guests today, and we stand by for more. Thanks.